"Have you eaten?" he asked them all, noticing Osrith, Phelim and Eswi watching him. "I gave enough silver for breakfast," Osrith told him. "The landlord is around, he should be able to find you something." A handful of bread and meat, after downing a jar of ale, and Angus carried his breakfast as they all walked to the cathedral. A lot of other people were crowding by the door, many of them old, but some of them younger and well-dressed. As several children darted between legs, inventing their own entertainment, while, every so often, parents pulled them back towards them. "They clearly think there's something happening," Osrith remarked, and they stood in the queue, as the doors stood firmly closed against them. They were merely bystanders, interested in the judgment of the lord or the lady, who would be sitting to hear cases that day, and Osrith wondered who it could be, for surely Athelstan, only a little older than 12-year-old Edra, and someone who, for the interest of everyone, had been elusive for most of his life, would not be sitting in the chair to hear the people. It did not take long for the doors to open, however, and behind them, Osrith noticed, more people had joined the queue. Those at the front crossed the stone floor, where, unusually, glazed windows filtered the light through into the nave. Ahead of the queue a large chair sat, at the center of the cross shape of the cathedral. A man sat in it. "Can you see who?" Osrith asked of Eswi, but he shook his head. "I have never seen the child," he replied, and Osrith realized, of the three of them, only she had. "We need to get closer, we need a cover story," she added, and Eswi told this to Angus and Phelim. They were robbed by the Norse, and seek repairs to the ship until they could get underway, Angus suggested. It was good enough, and Osrith agreed. Then, as some of the people peeled away from the front of the queue, Osrith saw in the light, a lord of Wessex. Ethelm. Panic gripped her stomach. If he recognized her, she knew, Ethelm would know she had locked the door on Edward, and would know of Eardgilf's murder. "We need to go, now," Osrith hissed to Eswi, and he took her shoulder, making a play that there was a problem with a pregnant woman in the queue, turning her back on the judgment meeting, Phelim to her left, Angus to her right. She managed 3 steps before a hand clamped her shoulder. A voice came to her ear, the first instruction being not to talk, and the second to walk as quickly as she was able towards the cathedral's doors. Osrith did both, and was greeted by the sun, on this first day of November, shining merrily down onto Gloucester's commercial streets. "Fancy finding you here," the voice continued. Osrith turned slowly and looked into the face of the man arresting her. Father Pylig was grinning his affable grin to her, and she relaxed. Beside her, Phelim and Angus had withdrawn their swords. Later, Osrith would have cause to remember, that Eswi did not. "I last saw you in Aylesbury," Pylig told her, happily. "It is good to see you, Osrith." "Pylig," she exclaimed. Osrith did not know the priest well, but he was a regular feature beside Bicca when Alfred was alive, and when Bicca had died, beside Edward. "You are fancying your chances, aren't you?" he asked, eyes darting to her companions. "Come," Pylig added, and nodded to the warriors, his look lingering for a second longer on Eswi's face. "I know a place we can go, where we won't be understood." The alehouse they ended up in was a good 2 miles walk from the city. A thin, black-haired woman seemed to be in charge, and Pylig greeted her with a kiss. She held out her hands to him, and he kissed them, saying something low to her, which made her smile. "God in heaven, my wife," Pylig told the 4 of them, as a girl brought ales across to them. "I have no doubt she would be better off in another man's company, but she won't have it and insists on remaining married to me." He broke off so he could sip on the ale. Hesitatingly, Angus and Phelim did the same. Osrith did not, and Eswi got to his feet. "She needs milk, or water," he explained, as Pylig raised his eyes to Eswi, and he strode away to the bar. Osrith watched him go, and then looked back to Angus, who had switched to Gaelish to ask Osrith what was going on, and who this man was. His hand was on his sword, as was Phelim's. And then Osrith realized why it was Eswi was able to get a drink for her, and that she could understand the people around them. In Pylig's alehouse, the customers were all talking in Cymric. "Cymric," Osrith said aloud, and Pylig smiled. "I have a lot of exiles needing a place to meet," he told them. and slapped the table. But Angus was still looking at Osrith. Pylig is an ally, she told Angus and Phelim in Gaelish, although Osrith wondered whether she believed it. But they were here, weren't they? She then repeated it in Cymric. We don't speak that Cymric here, Pylig told her. Would you prefer English? Although I am not sure I am totally competent. Saxon, yes, and South Wallin Cumbric, Angus told him, and he laid his sword onto the table. No need for that, Pylig told him. We are kin, are we not? We are not Saxon, he laughed. Angus did not. How did you know I was there? Osrith told him. I mean, we were supposed to meet Aethelstan. Aethelstan is not in Gloucester, and if he is to be kept safe, he will never be in Gloucester. Osrith looked up as Eswi put a jar of cooled boiled water in front of Osrith, and glanced at Pylig, grimly. Then, why are we here? Asked Phelim. If there is no purpose for us being in Gloucester, there is a purpose, my Pictish friend, Pylig replied, placing his ale on the table, then looked across to Osrith. You nearly ended up in a good deal of hot water. If Ethelelm had seen you... Edward was furious when he was finally released. He missed Tutord's coronation and his abdication in favor of Ethelfled, because you locked him in. Angus looked across to Osrith, raising his eyebrows. Osrith stared back. I was trying to get back home, Osrith told him. I was about to be... delayed. So I delayed Edward. And Pylig slapped the table loudly with his hand and burst into a booming laugh. Well now, he chortled. You got away all right, and got back to Alba? Yes, he nodded to Phelim and Angus. Then, Pylig looked at Eswi. You look well, my friend. Osrith looked across to Eswi. Pylig knew him. Aethelstan, Pylig told him. He is the key to Hywel. Aethelstan is to whom Hywel swore, as a child, here in Gloucester. He travelled all the way here from Tydewied about to the potentially bastard child of Alfred's son. Can you not think why? Money, Angus suggested. Land? Could be, my Cumbric friend, Pylig replied. But more than that. Alliance. Hywel wishes to gain the whole of Wales under his own rule, when his uncle dies. And Alfred and Edward have sworn to do this, in perpetuity. In perpetuity, Pylig replied. Every generation, Alfred's line, Hywel's line. Osrith watched Eswi glance to Pylig. And what has this to do with Aethelstan? Osrith asked the obvious question. Why have we come all this way, with a wave pushing us directly to the city, to find out something that we could find out by letter? Because letters, Merch, are compromisable. Any letter traveling from any monarch has been read at least half a dozen times before it reaches its intended destination. No, Pylig added. You needed to find me, and the only way you could would be to attend a public event at a known time. So, not Aethelstan? Osrith felt like she was losing the thread of the conversation. Not directly. But, as I said, Hywel has already sworn to the boy, despite Edward having other children, despite Aethelstan's legitimacy being in question. Why? I have no idea, Osrith thought. Anarod, Angus replied. Anarod, and his fundamental hatred of everything Saxon. Exactly, my friend, exactly. Pylig replied. Hywel has spent his life engineering conditions so he can take kingdom after kingdom in Wales, conquering by popularity, naturally, with compassion, with justice. And his prize, my friends, Gwynedd. It was Phelim, now, the quietest of the warriors, who used this reserved part of his nature to deadly effect on the battlefield. The Pictish lord suggested just what Osrith was thinking. Gwynedd, my friends, Pylig laughed. This kingdom, unwilling to make alliances except, perhaps, with the Norse, is Hywel's aim, and Anarod knows it. He encourages the north of Dublin to raid into Deheubarth. But there is one thing the king of the Henogled has in his favour, and that is? It was Eswi who spoke now. But Pylig shook his head. You came by ship, ha ha, he laughed, as Osrith nodded. The tidal bore. I was expecting you sooner. We failed to take the spring tide into account. It did no harm, except, perhaps to Osrith. Eswi gently teased. A little sick, he added. Pylig nodded. And you went home, Merch, back to Alba? To have your child? Osrith nodded. You are in your bloom, Pylig declared. taking up her hand and kissing the back of it. Women are most beautiful when they are great with child. He looked across to the bar, where his wife was serving ale. I always loved it when Half was pregnant. She was so beautiful when, he gave a growling laugh, which he curtailed quickly when he realized he wasn't in wholly male company. So, Osrith attempted to summarize, as the name Half stirred a memory in her mind. We have come to Gloucester in a clandestine manner, to meet you, Father Pyleague. And we are here, in your very pleasant alehouse. She leaned towards the priest. Why? Pyleague leaned towards her, and smiled. To meet Hywel, of course, he replied. To deliver your message to him from your King Constantine and take his reply back. 888,888,888. Osrith wondered whether it was just her who was feeling more than a little lackluster about her mission so far. They had sailed away from Strathclyde, it was true, in a ship with very Norse-like features, which probably explained why they had had no trouble from the Norse, expecting to gain intelligence in Gloucester for Constantine. The most they could take back was the news that Ethelhelm had been allowed to preside the Witan for, presumably, Mercia, and that Aethelstan and Ethelfled were campaigning in Cester. This land used to be Cymric, Pyleague told them, after they had finished their drinks in the alehouse and were now walking in the open plain which opened out to the south of Nsefn. The sun was high now, and it irradiated them all with an unseasonal warmth. A flock of sparrows swooped past them, as Pyleague nodded forward. Somerset, all the way down into Devonshire and Cornwall, far away. I grew up just over there. When I was a child, all of the land here was owned by Britons. Britons farmed, Britons fished, Britons traded. Then Wessex campaigned west and added British lands to their country, giving it to strong lords to rule. Are we here for a sightseeing tour? Grumbled Angus, unhappily in Gaelish to Osrith as he stumped behind her. Osrith turned and smiled at him. We might be. He promises us Hywel, she conceded. There can be no enemy spies in this country to hear what we discuss, Pyleague replied, catching Angus's gist. And Osrith translated it back to him. The huge Strathclydian Mormor looked at Pyleague, as if he were growing to hate the priest, then shrugged, and nodded to Osrith. We have come a long way for you to tell us Hywel is bonded by treaty to Wessex, she told him. I was at Tenhull, he came and honoured his alliance. So does this mean Wessex is about to supply men to Deheubarth for him to attack Aberfraw? Pyleague threw back his head and laughed. No, no, he qualified. Hywel wants something much more than that. He fell suddenly silent. Before and, if you noticed, though you may not have known, Anar Ord was not at Tenhull. He hates the Mersons. Ethliad, Ceolwulf, right back to offer, having curd in the north of Wellies and raided so often that all of Gwynedd kill any man on sight suspected of being of Mercia. Pyleague stopped walking suddenly and turned to Osrith, then put his hands out to her jerkin, patting over her chest. The SHRMM of 3 blades leaving scabbards made him step back as Osrith pushed his arms away. Forgive me, but the last spies I dealt with had concealed weapons, Pyleague told her. And I wanted to make sure that, but Osrith was pulling up her shirt, so her baby bump benefited from the weak November sunlight. Pyleague stared at her stomach and then back to Osrith, as she stared defiantly at the priest. Dimsjan, Osrith shouted back, harshly, mixing up her languages. She was tired, and to her, the trip seemed pointless. Pyleague, who had got a quick glimpse of large teats on rounded breasts, fought away images of spread-eagling a woman who once looked as Osrith did, holding on to her firm roundness and plunging himself into her ripe folds. Forgive me, he said again, ignoring the brief twitch under his cassock, and he backed away from Osrith, who was pulling her shirt over her stomach and tucking what she could into her breeches. He cleared his throat, and looked to Eswi. As I was saying, Hywel, he continued. He wants something more. He looked across to Angus. I am guessing you are the Strathclyder, Dyfnwal's man? Constantine's man. Angus replied fiercely. Dyfnwal is a little shit who is trying to ally with the Norse in exchange for rebellion. My king seeks to quickly end his ambitions. Oh, yes, Peleg replied. Eochaid's son. The throne of Alba. I do remember now, he added, as if it was some long ago memory. The heir? Peleg glanced back to Osrith. Do you mean me or my child? Osrith asked. What does Diffintwill think? Peleg asked her. He knows my mother was of Rust, so I am a Strathclyder to him. He says I am the last of Coelhen's line. And she found that Peleg was bowing to her. I am glad to be amongst royalty, he said. But Osrith shook her head. Not me, she said, then glanced at Angus and Felim. Though Diffinwill seems desperate enough. His line ends with him, he tells me. She sighed, and Eswe took her hand. Can you get to the point, father? You can help us reach Highwill. I can, Peleg conceded. But it isn't that simple. Not only does Highwill desire Gwynedd to unify the Cymric tongue, he also desires an influence in Strathclyde. He glanced at Angus. Pitland too, if he can. A return traverse where once your ancestors came. But Osrith was still none the wiser. A quick look at Angus's face, though, made her think that someone knew him, possibly. But she was too tired to think, and she was hungry. So, you can take us to Highwell, back to Wallis? Osrith made an attempt to conclude. Indeed, lady, Peleg replied. Tomorrow dawn. On your ship. We board separately, you, your warriors, me. If spies are on us, and there will be, firstly, there will be none in my alehouse. Secondly, there will be nothing to report. Peleg met with warriors. Peleg drank with warriors. Peleg boarded a ship. So, she would have to be patient. And the generous priest invited them back to the alehouse for the remainder of the day and the evening, promising beds, promising food. 88,888,888. Osrith was glad to be sitting with Peleg's wife that evening, as their two elder children, both in their young adulthood, kept the bar. Felim, Angus and Eswe sat with Peleg on more comfortable chairs than in the main alehouse, beside a newly stoked wood fire by a hearth, and they sat at the other side. Half, a little younger than Peleg, and probably no more than 10 years older than Osrith, combed through Osrith's short, stubby hair and styled what she could with Eric's jewel. She spoke to her in Cymric, but Osrith could not discern a lot. It seemed that some of the words were similar to the Cumbric she had learned, but the words seemed to be in a different order, and occasionally completely different. But they managed to get by, and Half, who was nothing like the beautiful, little blonde-haired servant she had met with the same name in Caerliguilid, looked at Osrith with chestnut-brown eyes, her long black hair, greying in places, plaited down her back. Plant, Half said, and made to touch Osrith's stomach. Belash, no Gaeleg? Osrith asked, forgetting the language she was speaking in. Mab Wyfurch? Half laughed. Of course it was a boy or a girl, but that was not what Osrith meant. Mab, Half said, touching her stomach. Bed warm Mab, why Dormerch, she told Osrith. She and Peleg had 4 sons and 2 daughters. Grown up now, Osrith noticed, as some of them were working in the bar. And these were, presumably, some of their grandchildren, sitting with one another, 2 very small ones under a fir. A bigger girl invading Half slapped between her and Osrith, giving her a look of challenge. This is my grandmother, go away. Osrith laughed, and then winced, holding her side. The day had been tiring and the bed in the alehouse had been very uncomfortable. She is a beauty, is she not? Peleg asked, as the men, on their 3rd ale, were more amiable with one another than they had been that morning. He liked plump women. Half had been like that once, until the care of the alehouse and of their children and grandchildren burned the flesh from her, and she was now thin and pale. He clutched the air in front of him, imitating holding breasts. Angus and Felim roared with approval. Eswe smiled, glanced at Osrith, and then back at his ale. I would have had her on her back by now, Angus boasted, those tits in my hands, working them, my sword pushed right up onto her scabbard. No you wouldn't. Felim scoffed. She would have gutted you before you even laid a hand on her. There, my Pictish friend, we agree to disagree, but, he took a sip of the ale. It was good, sweet, softly bitter, a good flavor even if it was Merson beer, as you know. She is our king '(s). Always has been Constantine's. And the child? Peleg asked. Constantine's also? She says not, we replied, quietly, but firmly. I can attest she has not been near the king for nearly a year. Peleg looked across to the Gale, then nodded. However, a common assumption. He thinks it is, Phelim added, flexing his fingers around his ale, before drinking deeply. Understandably, Angus put in, snorting into his drink. He nailed her when she was just ... Let me see ... 11, 12, Pew. He added, thinking about a girl of a similar age that he had taken, all taut and firm under his eager fingers and tight-cunted, which drew his foreskin backwards and forwards in an unbelievably toe-curling manner, and caused him to lose his load into her in a very short time. Whatever had happened to her, he wondered, idly. Then, Peleg concluded, it would do Osrith well to allow that common assumption to be ... commonly assumed. He bent his head. Do you confirm, Angus Naltclut, that you did see King Anarord with ... the child, at Bardney? Angus, whose thoughts had still been on the filthy side, shifted his mind to Peleg and the priest's question, the ultimate question, he supposed. Aye, he replied. Oh, he was there, all right, with his grandfather, his Uncle Idwell. Going in for the feast. We just about managed to avoid them. Despite the king's best efforts. They did not see Osrith. Angus shook his head. We were assailed by then, he confirmed, and Phelim and Eswi nodded. You see that man over there? Peleg said, keeping his eyes determinedly in the other direction. The one by the door? Phelim turned to Peleg, and narrowed his eyes. You said we could talk freely here, he challenged, putting down his jar of ale, firmly. As a distraction, Peleg beckoned to a young man, and pointed to the ale pot. Idris, my son, another, for this good man here. Peleg clapped Phelim on the back, and drew him to him. The young man, dark hair to his shoulders and the same features and all-encompassing grin as his father, took up Phelim's jar, and Angus's too. Eswi was making long work of his own, and Peleg glanced to him, a flash of discomfort on his features. Hywell's man. He is meant to see us. I want him to see us. I want him to know we are all here, together in Gloucester, preparing to meet the King of Deheubarth. He glanced to Angus, and then to Eswi. He will see what I want him to see. And in the morning, when we sail the place once called Dyft, we can speak more freely. Peleg broke off, as his wife approached. Osrith, wrapped in her cloak, stood beside her, her face pale and pallid. Osrith will remain here, Half told Peleg. You, and the men can sleep in stables while I take care of her. What's wrong? Asked Eswi, reaching for Osrith. She smiled at him, weakly, and reached out a hand for a moment. Just ... sickness, she replied. A good night's rest and she will be much better, Half concluded, a big, comforting smile for Osrith as she put her arm around her and escorted her to the stairs at the back of the alehouse's bar. Eswi got up, and thanked Peleg for his hospitality. Going with the lady, Eswi answered Peleg's unasked question, nodding to Angus and Phelim, adding in Gaelish, if she is at risk, I need to be with her. Before dawn, Osrith rose from the bed that Half had shown her to. Outside the shuttered windows a soft drifting of snow was coming. The woman was asleep, her black hair on the pillow, and Osrith pulled on her jerkin and boots. Milk and bread she found in the kitchen at the back of Peleg's bar, and she found Peleg's son, who was clearing out the closed fireplace as beside him a woman was kneading bread. She turned when Osrith poured herself a drink and the man got up, and moved to her. Here, Osrith said, and handed silver to the man. I am grateful. He narrowed his eyes as he tried to understand what she was saying, and the woman turned to him and spoke to him quickly. You do not need to give me silver, the man replied in English, and placed the coins back in front of her. My father tells me you are a guest. He nodded towards the stables. Wait here when the men wake, you may meet them. My father says I am to show you the way back to your ship. And Osrith waited, as the man and the woman went out into the alehouse front room and began to clean and tidy. She could not wait, though, despite what Peleg said. They were to be aboard at dawn, to travel west along the Wellies coast, and so she parcelled up the bread, and a dollop of lorat she had spied in a linen-covered bowl, draining the milk, before pushing open the back door into a very crisp and chilly backyard. A pair of hens squeaked at Osrith as she trod her way over to the stables, and pushed open the door. 2 horses puffed at the change in temperature, and she pushed the door closed behind her, flexing her hands in the equine warmth of the animals, and closed her eyes for a moment and listened. Apart from the dull clomping of hooves about her, the loft sounded empty. They must have already gone, Osrith considered, and turned, making to go back out into the stable yard. Should she wait for Pylig's son? She could get back to the river herself. In fact, if they had already left, they would be waiting for her, and dash. A noise above her made her stop, and Osrith let the stable door swing closed on its hinges. A huffing noise, huffing and panting. She looked across to the horses. No, they were asleep, shifting a little as they stood almost rigid. More huffing, getting more urgent, and Osrith moved to the ladder, and looked up. Above, a skylight betrayed dawn's light, a grey, sludgy morning light, so different to the morning before. More huffing, and more, as if a speed was increasing. Men's voices, deep, low, panting, huffing, exertion. A cry came from someone, a release of some kind. Osrith moved up the ladder, and then shrunk back. Long hair tumbled over the face of one man, while another held onto his hips, sinking his cock into the man's arse, while his hand was round at the front, covered in ejaculate. God, forgive me. The man being done had come first, and Osrith saw that it was Eswi, hiding the manhood of another man in his arse. Like Finoli, Osrith thought, as she climbed back down the steps, scurrying to the bridles, and hid down, sitting behind a pile of 3 saddles. Findle, his brother. Finolao, who was not excited by her body, not excited by any woman's body, and who had set his sights on, and won, the body of Domnall MacCorstin Ui Alpin. Both priests, at some time in their lives, too. A man was coming down, and he stopped near the door and was looking back up to the loft. It was Pylig. Pylig's eyes were on the steps, and, eventually, Eswi descended, pulling his robe about him. Eswi had been guarding the door behind which Osrith had slept, hadn't he? Clearly for not the whole night. You can come out, Osrith, Eswi called softly, when Pylig had left the stables. Osrith got up. That puke-inducing lor, he explained, before Osrith had asked. I would have thought it would make you worse. We are to go now? Osrith asked. Engus and Phelim are already there? Eswi nodded. Here, he said, taking the small package of Osrith's and pointed upwards. We need to go across the roof and down, so we are not seen. Osrith felt her eyes widening. Eswi turned back to her slowly in his pursuit of the stairs. 3 months I was here, training, in the cathedral, Eswi confessed. I ran away from Tidui, where I was supposed to be and where I met Pylig. Eswi sighed the man's name, as if it was heavy weight within him that he had just unloaded. I escaped several times over his father's stable's roof when we were nearly caught. Before I was sent to Strathclyde, as punishment. He began to climb the stairs, Osrith following. We have not lost our closeness, and we have to climb the roof, Osrith asked. But it was not as Osrith imagined. The stable roof was flat and there was a raised walkway which led to an iron ladder. Eswi helped Osrith down, and they walked at speed through the city centre of Gloucester, along the grid-laid streets, and beyond the cathedral. As the land dropped gradually to the river, Osrith could see that there were 2 figures on their boat, and as they neared, she found they were indeed Phelim and Engus. When he saw them, Phelim waved a greeting, his butter-blonde hair blowing in the breeze. We have enough provisions for a week, he told them cheerfully. That priest you know, Eswi, he added, was very generous. That is because I am expecting something good when I put a few planks of tree between myself and the Cimmerian Sea. The voice came behind them, and Osrith had no need to turn to know it was Father Pylig. As a Phelim helped Osrith aboard, she looked between Eswi and Pylig, who made very brief, solemn eye contact. Here's your lor, Eswi said, and some water. Will you do us a favor and wait until we are out into the open sea before you open it? 88,888,888. They followed the same coast along which they had come a few days before, but not at all as quickly. The wind, bringing flurries of snow, was pushing on them relentlessly, and Eswi and Phelim used all their strength to press on the tiller as Angus tacked starboard and then port to inch their way along. A night, and then another aboard was making Osrith very stiff, and it took the men, when they were not fying the wind with the ship, to sit close to her to stop her shivering. "Please tell me Hywel's palace is warm," Osrith asked Pylig, when, for a moment, the wind had ceased its howling, "that it has thick walls and a fire." "It does, that," Pylig agreed, as he held Osrith's cloak close to her body, and she bent her head, not in sickness but to get the wind out of her face. "A place where two people, a strong man and a soft woman, could sit together and place tender hands on one another unseen." Osrith laughed, at the weak chat-up line, and at the knowledge that he had reignited a liaison with a lover. 2 more days and she would know what Hywel's palace would be like. And Osrith would, on some of the worst days, wish she was back on the ship with Pylig trying out his flimsy flirtation with her, as they were soaked with icy winter brine. 88,888,888. As 4 mariners battled a storm in what would, at some stage in the future, be called the Bristol Channel, a fire burned within a grate beside which 5 people sat. "Was he there, who we suspected?" asked one, draining an ale cup. He put it next to his comrades and turned to listen to his lord. "Yes." The man nodded, looking greedily to the man's form, looking for any sign of a money bag. "I made a good show to make sure I was seen. I did not linger." "Good." The lord nodded, then broke into a coughing fit. Rancid ooze flowed out of a gut wound in sporadic gulps. The woman leaned forward, not reacting at all to the foul stench. "And you know where this blade is?" "Ice Spite," the Dane replied. "He was there for the silver, nothing more." "It is in a wild place, full of savage people," he added, licking his lips. The lord leaned forward and hacked his cough again. "I know this, because it was mine," the Dane said, "stolen from me, used on you. And when you have found it, and used it," he added, looking at the healer woman,